privilege to welcome you all to Auburn University at Montgomery's Civil Rights and Civic Virtue Society Speaker Series Breakfast. The series is one of the activities funded by a generous grant from the John Templeton Foundation titled From Civil Rights to Civic Virtue, Forming Character Through Community. Today's lecture is the first in a series of events this semester. We'll be hosting breakfast events on February 8th, February 22nd, a luncheon on March 8th, and then a breakfast event on March 22nd. At those events, you'll have opportunities to hear from AUM alumni Jonathan Avant and Jana Bailey. You'll hear from Lorraine Arthamensa, a project director with Local Projects, a design firm instrumental in the design of the Legacy Museum and Memorial. And then Henry Allen Jr., the first fire chief for African-American fire chief in Selma and participant in the march from Selma to Montgomery. We're excited about these lecture events, these speaker events. We'll also be hosting a conference, a joint conference with faculty in the College of Sciences who are working on a grant related to inclusive teaching practices in STEM education. Finally, you'll be hearing very shortly, very soon, some recruitment materials for faculty, staff, and students for our first summer seminar, where we'll be hosting some prominent speakers, including the historian Hassan Kwame Jeffries, who is one of the lead hosts of the podcast Teaching Hard History, and several other prominent researchers, where we'll focus on civil rights, the civil rights movement, its history, civic virtues, the cultivation of civic virtues, and character education. That summer seminar will also involve some field trips, opportunities for systematic reflection with faculty, staff, and students. So we're very excited about those events. All of these opportunities are grounded in our mission to foster civic identity, commitment, and civic mindedness through community-engaged learning opportunities. Toward this end, the speaker series provides a forum for us to host individuals who can increase our understanding of Alabama, of the civil rights movement, and the individual heroes who work to pursue justice in our area. We have much to learn from our community. It also serves as a space for us to increase understanding of core civic virtues, traits such as justice, courage, hope, perseverance, and solidarity. These are virtues that we see enacted in the lives of historic exemplars like Claudette Colvin, whose courageous actions we heard described at the Martin Luther King Jr. Legacy Breakfast last week. In that space, we also learned about the ongoing pursuit of justice in the work of individuals like Judge Calvin Williams, who expunged her criminal record and offered apology for a system that perpetrated a great injustice. As you listen to today's lecture, I would invite you to consider how the Alabama Department of Archives and History's Statement of Recommitment may itself exhibit a deep concern for justice. As the philosopher Margaret Urban Walker argues, quote, "Societies have a duty to be historically accountable, to aim at truthful representation of their history, and it is a virtue in citizens to see that their societies strive to be accountable in this way. Historical accountability matters because of its impact on our interpersonal, social, and political relationships, especially when it concerns the acknowledgement of the troubling, shameful, and sordid aspects of a society's history that often have enduring effects," unquote. The Archive's Statement of Recommitment exhibits this concern for historical accountability, and it exhibits courage in challenging historical narratives and practices, hope in seeking to realize a representation of Alabama's history that is at once inclusive and reflective of the value and beauty in Alabama's rich history. It reflects perseverance in an enduring commitment to continue this work in the face of obstacles, and solidarity with those in Alabama's histories whose stories are not yet known, but which deserve to be part of the record. After the presentation today, we'll open the floor for some questions. I'll have a mic that I can roam around the room with so that you can ask your question and it can be heard. And at the conclusion of the event, there's a QR code at the bottom of your program that we would ask you to click on and give us some feedback about the event. Without further delay, I would like to invite Dr. Ben Severance, professor in the Department of History and World Cultures, who will introduce our guest speaker. Dr. Severance.
Thank you, Aaron. Good morning, everyone. Great. I've known our guest speaker, Steve Murray, for well over 10 years and have always enjoyed opportunities to work with him on various aspects of Alabama history. And so it's my honor to introduce him to you here this morning. Steve Murray is director of the Alabama Department of Archives and History. This is the state agency that serves as the permanent repository for state government records, a special collections library, and the state's history museum. Murray became director in 2012 after serving for 6 years as the assistant director for administration. His prior experience in public history includes service as the managing editor of the Encyclopedia of Alabama and the Alabama Review, both at Auburn University. From 2013 to 2020, Murray was a member of the Alabama Bicentennial Commission and co-chaired its Education Committee. He co-chaired the Alabama World War I Centennial Committee and is a past president of the Alabama Historical Association. At the national level, his service includes terms on the Council of State Archivists and the board of the American Association for State and Local History. At the State Archives and in public history networks, Murray has been an advocate for historical introspection as a basis for building organizational inclusiveness. Honest examination of the archive's history is a key element of the agency's 2020 Statement of Recommitment, the subject of his talk today. He's a native of Louisiana, but Murray has called Alabama his home since he began graduate school at Auburn University in 1993. He and his wife Laura have 3 children and 1 grandchild. Finally, when Steve took over at the State Archives in 2012, he replaced Ed Bridges, who many of you know is one of the great scholars in Alabama. At the time, I recall folks telling me that Steve had some big shoes to fill, and that's fair enough. But anyone who knows Steve will agree that he has performed magnificently in his position, bringing grace, certitude, and genuine vision to the directorship of the State Archives. In the process, he has created even bigger shoes to fill for whoever succeeds him, which we all hope is in the very distant future. Please welcome Steve Murray.
Well, good morning. It is a real honor to be with the AUM community this morning and to talk about a subject that is important to our institution at the Department of Archives and History, but one that I believe is important to our entire nation and society right now, and that really touches on issues that are at the core of our understanding about who we are as a people, about the ties that bind us together as a society, and the level of our commitment to maintaining and improving the health of those ties today and in the decades ahead. We are facing some difficult issues, and I think all of you here, all of us, have a responsibility to be invested in trying to be sure that we as a community, as a state, and as a nation are doing all that we can to energize, grow, and to nourish those relationships at some key moments in our history. And it's a challenge, but I look forward to hearing your questions and responses. I'm very interested in your comments about the topic that I'll be speaking on today, and would love to continue those conversations well beyond this morning. I want to thank AUM for hosting this series and making these important conversations available to the community here. I also want to acknowledge that AUM has been very good to the Department of Archives and History over the years. We have several staff members who have, quite a few, come to us as student workers and as interns and have over the years become permanent full-time employees at our institution and played critical leadership roles and professional roles in our work as an institution. So we're grateful for that relationship, and I'm going to close out today by talking about some new opportunities that I hope students here will take advantage of. Today, I want to share with you some thoughts on our current historical moment, a present opportunity for Alabamians and Americans to engage in some introspection and honest dialogue about our shared history, the significance of the past for our present situation, and what it means for our future. In ordinary times, history professionals expend a tremendous amount of energy and time trying to get the public's attention. We make arguments for the value and relevance of history for purposes of strengthening our civic fabric, for the training of future employees with good critical thinking skills, and for supporting good economic development. But the past few years, I think we can all agree, have been no ordinary time. Politics have divided our society to a degree not seen since the 1960s. A global pandemic, unlike anything we have seen in 100 years, shook us from our positions of presumed 21st century safety and robbed us of conveniences that we take for granted. And then the cell phone video of the killing of George Floyd appeared on the screens that have become ever present in our lives. The eruption of protests that followed pushed history to the center stage of our national discourse. At one level, history became essential for understanding the demonstrations against policing practices and against deeper currents of systemic racism. At another level, history became a focal point in the form of debates over public commemoration, statues on courthouse grounds, names on public buildings, and portraits in the halls of Congress. Communities have spent a great deal of time grappling with complex questions. Whose history is represented here? Why are these monuments erected in the first place? Who made decisions about their purpose at the time, and who gets to decide now whether they still have a place in the public square? How is it possible to change history in the way apparently advocated by some? And what is systemic racism anyway? And what does it have to do with the way we live our lives in the 21st century? The bestseller lists in 2020 told us that white Americans, a minority of white Americans, but still a substantive portion, were wanting to engage these questions at a level we had not seen before. They included those who lean left politically but have never really studied our nation's racial history closely. They also included mainstream folks whose interpersonal relationships or theology or civic commitment drive them to the conclusion that something is wrong in our society and that we owe it to ourselves and our neighbors of color to understand the problem. And they included community promoters, economic developers, who know that the conflicts seen in 2020, as well as the physical reminders of earlier chapters in our history, can be bad for business. A larger portion of white America remained skeptical and was not ready to engage these questions. Some of them pointed, quite legitimately, to the concerns of poor whites who likewise struggle with underemployment and gaps in the social safety net. Some find bewildering and thoroughly off-putting the proliferation of identity politics on the left. Some object to a perceived disrespect for tradition, for the achievements of previous generations, and the resulting cleansing of the landscape of anything deemed objectionable, the so-called cancel culture. African Americans came to the discussion with personal or family histories demonstrating how fundamental and long-standing these questions are in their experiences. Some felt utterly fatigued by the prospect of trying to explain again how George Floyd's death sits at one end of a thread that runs throughout the entirety of American history, from slavery to the Black Codes, to the Klan, to the convict lease system, to Jim Crow, to disfranchisement, to redlining, to gerrymandering, to the White Citizens Council, to every obstacle erected by government in the way of progress toward civil and voting rights. to white flight from neighborhoods and public schools, to discriminatory sentencing guidelines, and to mass incarceration. Most would say they have been waiting a long time to have this conversation in a thorough way. So suddenly, history professionals were faced not with the challenge of coaxing the public to history, but with addressing the needs and questions of diverse audiences in a moment when history demanded attention. This is where the Alabama Department of Archives and History found itself in the first week of June 2020. Our staff was wrestling with the same anxiety and frustration that gripped most of society. During an online meeting, because we were all entirely online in those weeks, discussion focused primarily on our care for each other and the imperative of racial justice. We also spoke of the relevance of historical understanding for the moment, as well as our collective responsibility to make history useful. On that same day and the next, statements supporting racial justice and the Black Lives Matter movement were proliferating from corporations, governments, museums, and other organizations. The obvious questions arose. Should the archives make a statement? And what would it say? Our first thought was to return to a theme of that staff meeting, the responsibility to make history useful. Public service is core to the mission and culture of our organization. Within a week of closing due to pandemic conditions in mid-March of that year, our staff launched a new website, Alabama History at Home, to function as a clearinghouse for online resources useful for education and entertainment during isolation. The resources include a digital exhibit and book on the history of Alabama's state constitutions, photographs and textual materials documenting the long struggle for civil and voting rights, and hours of recorded public programs related to slavery, Reconstruction, and other topics from African American history. I think Dr. Severance makes at least a couple of appearances in that collection. As white Americans were voicing, to a seemingly unprecedented degree, a desire to grasp the underlying issues contributing to systemic racism, we knew these online resources could be useful for improving understanding and fueling dialogue. One obvious option was to release a statement promoting the availability of the resources in Alabama History at Home. We also knew that a statement consisting only of useful resources would be incomplete to the point of being dishonest. It would have omitted the fact that the archives was a major contributor to the intellectual underpinnings of systemic racism from 1901 until beyond the middle of the century, and that the legacy of those contributions linger with us still. After careful consideration, on June 23rd, we released a Statement of Recommitment containing a description of those useful online resources, but prefaced by a three-part acknowledgement. First, we acknowledge that systemic racism remains a reality in American society. Even if we were to assume that no new policies established today contain discriminatory provisions, we are surrounded by the legacies of centuries of discriminatory policy and behavior. Secondly, we said that one of the ways we know this to be true is by examining the origin and work of the archives. In quoting here from the statement, the state of Alabama founded the department in 1901 to address a lack of proper management of government records, but also to serve a white Southern concern for the preservation of Confederate history and the promotion of lost cause ideals. The architects, engineers, and evangelists of this work were Thomas McAdory Owen, who directed the agency from its founding until his death in 1920, and Marie Bankhead Owen, who succeeded her husband and served as director until 1955. The erudite Tom Owen searched every corner of the state for Confederate records and artifacts. From the archives offices, he staffed the Historical Committee of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, encouraged communities and other states to engage in documentation of the war, and worked with scholars to infuse both academic teaching and public history with the tenets of the lost cause: the benign nature of slavery, the moral superiority of the Confederate purpose, and the wretchedness of Reconstruction. Marie Owen, possessing a legendarily indomitable personality, maintained Tom's legacy while undertaking initiatives of her own. She secured legislation to replace the Reconstruction-era state seal and commissioned a state coat of arms incorporating the Confederate battle flag and a new state motto: "We dare defend our rights." During the debate over ratification of the 19th Amendment, which extended voting rights to women in 1920, Marie rose to national prominence in the anti-ratification campaign. She and other opponents of the 19th Amendment feared that constitutional protection for women's suffrage would usher in renewed federal enforcement of black voting rights under the 15th Amendment. The fault of the Owens was not in the decision to collect Confederate history, which is of indisputable importance, but in the disproportionate use of agency resources to preserve the Confederate past while declining to do anything remotely similar for the history of African Americans in Alabama. Our state and the South generally was the site of one of the most dramatic transitions in all of human history. In a 5-year period from 1865 to 1870, 4 million enslaved Americans, 400,000 of those in Alabama, went from being chattel property to being free people to being citizens of the United States, and for the men to being voters. Though only a quarter century removed from Reconstruction and even closer to the interracial alliances of the populist movement of the 1890s, our agency's founders did not seek to document the political and social embrace of freedom by formerly enslaved Alabamians. The Owens' priorities, shared by their white counterparts in other southern states, contributed to 2 troubling legacies. The first was the ubiquity of the lost cause in classrooms, textbooks, and popular culture throughout the 20th century, and its broad persistence to this day. The second is a profound deficit in the historical record that can never be fully overcome. Historically black colleges and universities and some other institutions have made vital contributions in documenting African American history, but the fact remains that the state's historical agency lost decades worth of potential effort. The Statement of Commitment's third acknowledgement addresses our shortcomings as a staff from a position of humility. For too long, our staff has not reflected the diversity of Alabama's population. Our work in preserving and sharing the past should reflect the contributions of professionals of color. Their absence diminishes trust in our agency on the part of African Americans, limits our effectiveness in reaching out to black donors and audiences, and does a disservice to the health of the larger professional field. We knew that any statement lacking such acknowledgments would ring hollow to African Americans possessing a justified distrust of Alabama state government. Only forthrightness could be the basis for building trust and for contributing to conversations about this historical moment and others. If the archives is to take a leading role in informing the interpretation of Alabama history today, it is necessary to be honest about our role a century ago. After making these acknowledgments, the statement turned to 4 objectives guiding our work moving forward. We said we would document and tell a fully inclusive story of Alabama's role in the American experience. 2, be a facilitator of mutually respectful discussions of personal, community, and state history. 3, increase diversity among our staff and on our board of trustees. And 4, model and advocate for responsible stewardship of controversial historical materials. I won't go through each of these in detail this morning, but let me say a bit about how we approach the objective of a fully inclusive history. The Statement of Recommitment codifies this objective as a priority, but this work is not new for us. The ship of the archives began a slow turn in this direction in the 1960s and 70s, and then quickened during the 30-year tenure of my predecessor, Ed Bridges, starting in 1982. A 30th anniversary symposium on the Montgomery bus boycott was a significant step forward for us, as was a special exhibition of photographs taken on Bloody Sunday in Selma. Not long after that, Ed started thinking about developing the capacity to tell Alabama's story in a new, fuller way. It took years of planning and work to get a building addition and then to design museum exhibits that opened in 2011 and 2014. After this, for the first time, some African American visitors told us they felt their stories were being included in the larger narrative of Alabama history. New acquisitions were also important to this process. None stands out more prominently or is more visually striking than more than 11,000 images in the Jim Pepler Southern Courier photograph collection, which have been entirely scanned and are all online. These images document the music, neighborhoods, voting rights activism, and daily lives of African Americans in central Alabama in the late 1960s. Other acquisitions followed, including the photographic archives of the Huntsville Times, the Birmingham News, and the Mobile Press Register, known collectively as the Alabama Media Group Collection. Spanning most of the second half of the 20th century, these images, numbering somewhere between 3 and 6 million, constitute an unparalleled visual record of all areas of life in Alabama during a period of tremendous change. Our public programming and special exhibits have seen important progress too. In 2019, we launched History Now, Conversations on the Past and Present. The first installment inverted the regular format of book talks for a discussion of a new book on the Montgomery police killing of Bernard Whitehurst in 1975. The author was present and gave a brief introduction to the book, but the audience sat facing each other and engaged in a conversation about the meaning of this episode for Montgomery in 1975 and today. Also in 2019, the state's bicentennial provided an opportunity to re-examine Alabama's defining documents, the 6 state constitutions and the 1861 Ordinance of Secession. The exhibition dealt forthrightly with the centrality of race and the evolution of state government and the prevailing purpose of maintaining white supremacy when our current Constitution was adopted in 1901. Now, we will continue these kinds of initiatives moving forward, using tools and processes that were unavailable to us just a few years ago. Especially important will be facilitating fresh examination of government records held in our collections and existing nowhere else. This is actually an opportunity that we didn't fully anticipate in the Statement of Recommitment, but has turned out to be an especially important one for us, examining in new ways government records that were in our collection that were not preserved for the purpose of illuminating African American history, but with the right tools and the right approaches can be used to great effect in that way. We have recently digitized materials such as the 1875 voter registration logs, which provide uncommonly good genealogical data and reflect the political engagement of African Americans in a period between emancipation and disfranchisement. Also coming online are around 500 volumes of Alabama Supreme Court case files from 1820 to 1877. These materials go beyond the published rulings of the court and include the motions, interrogatories, and exhibits considered by the court. Previously used only by scholars with a great deal of patience, because these records are difficult to navigate, these records will open for examination more than a half-century of important information on Alabama's early development, slavery, wartime, and Reconstruction. When you think about the types of cases that went to the state's appellate court system during these decades, and even today, very often civil cases have to do with property disputes. And what were some of the most valuable, monetarily speaking, pieces of property in Antebellum, Alabama? The enslaved people who provided labor on plantations all over the cotton growing region. As we undertake this work, let me also mention another project to digitize all of the governor's records from just on the eve of the Civil War all the way through Reconstruction, which is likewise providing some really terrific access to materials on that important period, including war and emancipation and Reconstruction. As we undertake this work, very much on the minds of our team is the question of how we regard organizational forebears who expended great effort distorting our state's history, but who also laid a foundation through institutional capacity, an extraordinary facility, and phenomenal, if incomplete, collections for today's generation to do much that is good. With resources made possible by the Owens, we subject records to fresh examination, document more fully the experiences of all Alabamians, and promote effective, inclusive history education. This is where our story at the archives connects to the larger concern of our state and nation at this historical moment. Just as the archives is called to reconcile with the problematic origins of an institution we cherish, our nation is called to reconcile with the faults of American democracy as crafted by the founders. And we have something of a deadline on the horizon. In 2026, the United States will mark the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the founding of the nation. It will be our semi-quincentennial. I hope you'll all go home. You have to stand in front of the mirror. Practice this a few times. Semi-quincentennial. If you break it apart, it's semi, half, quin, 5, and centennial, 100. So it's half of 100, or half of 500 rather, is our semi-quincentennial, or the 250th anniversary. Promise me that you'll go home and practice that. Use it at dinner tonight. Your kids will be amazed, I'm sure. So our semi-quincentennial approaches. A national commission and many private historical organizations are already busy developing plans for the objectives of the semi-quincentennial, how it resembles or differs from the bicentennial of 1976, what it will celebrate or commemorate, and each of those words has very distinct meanings, and how it might be framed in language acceptable to all Americans. I can tell you from watching these discussions that this work was fraught with difficulty before 2020 and that it has grown more challenging since. It is difficult because the constant state of friction characterizing our politics, our discussions of current events, and our understanding of the past. Through an historical lens, this friction is indicative of competing understandings of the American experience, competing visions of what our nation's history has been about. From one perspective, the American story is one of liberty, boundless opportunity, and a playing field made equal by the provisions of our founding documents. From another perspective, the American story is one of racial, ethnic, and gender minorities struggling continuously to overcome a stacked deck put in place by the very founders who expounded liberty and equality. The further we go into the future, the less compatible these two visions will be. A decision before us now is whether we continue to test these weakening bonds or we seek in our second 250 years to articulate a new American vision. It seems certain that this friction will increase as we head into the semi-quincentennial. Many of the founders will be subjects of debates over the meaning, achievements, and limitations of the Revolutionary era, but none will be more important or more divisive than Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was a political visionary, present at just the right time and in the necessary role to articulate the American creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Those words represent the core of the prevailing traditional version of the American vision, but Jefferson and the other founders knew in 1776 that it made a promise they were not yet able to keep. The institution of slavery, present in the U.S. for a century and a half by that time, belied the lofty ideals of the Declaration. Jefferson desired to see slavery abolished, but struggled to envision a process by which it could happen without causing economic disaster for white Southerners and posing the threat of interracial mingling. He initially hoped to contain slavery in the coastal South and see it wither there over time. But by the time of the Washington administration in the 1790s, Britain's Industrial Revolution was creating tremendous new demand for cotton. The cotton gin was being improved, and vast tracts of agricultural land in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana lay within reach if their native inhabitants could be removed. The Cotton South would inaugurate a harsher second phase of slavery suited to supplying an international industrial economy. By the time Alabama became a state in 1819, Jefferson had abandoned his hope of seeing slavery extinguished in his lifetime and concluded that the next generation would have to lead the way toward abolition. The best path in that direction, he felt, was to disperse slavery through westward expansion. Jefferson's contradictions became apparent at the personal level, too. He owned more than 600 enslaved people during his lifetime, selling them when necessary to cover his debts, but freeing only 2 individuals, despite his lamentations at the evils of the institution. He believed that whites and blacks could never live as equals in an integrated society, even though DNA testing has confirmed that he fathered 6 children with Sally Hemings, a woman he owned. In the current decade, Jefferson's hypocrisy has placed him among the historical figures whose monuments and statues have been removed from public parks. It is not difficult to see how Jefferson will become a lightning rod of controversy as we approach the 250th anniversary. But rather than dread it, I propose that we embrace it as an opportunity for developing skills that we will need in addressing other difficult issues. If we, from every point on the spectrum, can come to terms with Jefferson, perhaps we can have a productive reckoning with the American vision writ large and with other historical figures at the national, state, and local levels. American Sphinx, Joseph Ellis's examination of the character of Thomas Jefferson, is now about 25 years old. And although it's not the most recent scholarship on Jefferson, I think it offers a useful assessment of Jefferson's tendency to compartmentalize his contradictory impulses, and is written by a scholar who approached his subject with a respectful but critical eye. Ellis really isn't a fan of Jefferson. Specific to our current circumstances, Ellis offered some useful insights during an interview in 2021. In order to move past this moment of crisis with any of our national symbols intact, he suggested, Americans must become more comfortable with tragedy as a framing device for our national narrative, not unblemished moral superiority as maintained by some sentimentalists, nor something approaching a complete lie as posited by others, but a complex layering of potential and shortcoming, of gain and loss. This seems appropriate and reasonable to me. It can be a reasonable basis for shaping a shared vision of the American story as we move through the semi-quincentennial, and it is transferable to our considerations of monuments and of names on public buildings. In the case of Jefferson, a reasonable question is not whether he fell short of his own aspirations and our expectations, as he certainly did, but what was the net result of his contributions? What foundations did he lay on which we as a society could continue to build toward a more perfect union? Closer to home, in the case of the Owens or the names of buildings on university campuses, a reasonable approach might examine what those individuals left to us as groundwork on which the lives of Alabamians have been improved and can continue to be improved. This is a more complex process than merely detecting racist or segregationist sentiments as a litmus test, and it will take more work. Some will not measure up, but perhaps some will. Several ingredients are needed: people of goodwill, good history education, a willingness to complicate our understanding of the past and to take our heroes down a notch, a willingness to invest in correcting the mistakes of the past, and some sound leadership. If we move through the semi-quincentennial without undertaking this work, we will have missed a rare opportunity. Alabamians know the significance of a moonshot. If you've been following the news about the Saturn rocket at our North Alabama rest stop, you know how important that is as a landmark to people in that part of the state. And I do not think it hyperbole to say that this is our moonshot moment of the 21st century. We can stay on our present trajectories with rival visions of America, or we can choose to find a new basis for an American story that celebrates our ideals while recognizing our shortcomings and pledging our commitment to the fulfillment of our best potential. This is our task, our historical moment. Thank you.
Thank you for that talk. I would like to open the floor for people who have questions they would like to ask. I would like you, if you could, to speak the question into the microphone so that we can make sure we get it recorded. So the floor is open. I know we have a bunch of historians here. We have some archaeologists here who do work in archives as well. Yes, thank you. Hold on.
So thinking about where you are right now in your journey as director and thinking about where you started, what is one thing you've congratulated yourself on doing well, and what is one thing that was difficult that, like, back then you wish you knew what you knew now and would do differently?
Great questions. I will say one important thing that we worked very hard on throughout this process was good communication. And that started with our leadership, our governing board. We're very fortunate to have a board of trustees that is supportive of the institution. We knew that it was vital that we not just get a stamp of approval, but that we seek legitimate and earnest buy-in into what we were proposing as a staff about the way we speak about our work and what we think is important about the way we move forward as an institution. And so spending a lot of time thinking about both internal communication with staff, with our governing board, and then also the outward-facing communication in communicating what we're doing. And this is related to the statement, other initiatives we've had. You and I were talking earlier about our work on NAGPRA compliance, which has required many of those same investments in honest introspection and good communication. And so we've really worked hard to try to do that. A place where we fell short actually relates to one aspect of communication. And one of the things that I keep in mind, and something that I noticed in 2020 and beyond, is that sometimes there can be a natural and understandable reaction to individuals or conversations that we find frustrating, or people who don't want to have the same conversation about where we are as a society and where we want to go. And a an inclination sometimes just to steer away from that and to basically preach to the choir, so to speak, and to kind of circle up with all of our people who are supportive and kind of allied thinkers and actors on this landscape. And I think that's something we have to be careful to avoid. We as an institution, I talk all the time about those of us who work at our agency have the great privilege of coming to work in that beautiful building and working with these amazing collections every day, but every bit of it belongs to the taxpayers of Alabama. As a public institution, and I would say this includes AUM as a public institution, that we have responsibilities to serve all of our constituencies and all of the people in Alabama. And that means we have to keep working on having those difficult conversations. And so one thing I didn't do prior to the statement being released was actually to reach out to heritage organizations like the Sons of Confederate Veterans and United Daughters of the Confederacy, who play such an important role in the history of our institution and in the development of our collections over time. And that the statement was not received well by some folks, and it generated a great deal of speculation that we were suddenly backing trucks up to the archives and ejecting, everything from our collections related to the Confederacy, which is not true. Our purpose here is to widen and to enlarge the circle, not to start supplanting one type of material with another. So that was a lesson for me, in that I wish I had approached that differently. We had to go back and do some repair work in terms of communication rather than being proactive and being sure that we were speaking to all stakeholders. And they are among our stakeholders.
Hey, forgive me if I don't articulate this the best way. I'm still kind of forming it in my head. But a lot of times, at least audiences, when it comes to African American history, it seems to stop in 1968. And I noticed that in the presentation you had Dixon's Whitehurst book, talking about the 1975 case and whatnot. But I'm wondering about efforts to kind of continue bridging that gap. Unless I missed it in the presentation, I'm wondering about efforts that are being made to continue that history post the 1970s up until, of course, we see huge interest happen in Floyd because of pandemic and people are home and so they can care. But I'm talking about 70s, 80s, 90s, this time period in between. What are we doing for those, spaces?
More contemporary, recent history,
Yeah.
and that's a great question. As a rule, most collecting institutions, I think, history organizations, tend to struggle in our acquisitions programs with more recent events, because it's easier to define a collecting scope with a little bit of perspective, right? But that's the very thing we're faulting the Owens with not doing, is not thinking more about recent history a century ago. So we have developed contemporary collecting, and we did that actually in 2020. We started, again, this was kind of the outgrowth both of the pandemic, but also of the protests and demonstrations that were happening in our state and around the country at that time. So we began, it required modifying our acquisitions process so that we could more readily accept materials from demonstrators who were out in front of the Capitol, for example. There were demonstrations on our front steps at the archives during that summer. So we developed new processes, new forms, using technology to be sure that we were documenting collections and trying to bring those in a new way. We also are, part of that process of broadening our scope includes bringing in materials that we've never collected with a specific focus on LGBTQ plus history and that community of Alabamians. And so it is definitely one of those situations where we don't turn on a dime, but we are regularly committing effort and resources to being sure that we are trying to be more inclusive in what we're bringing into the collections. And that includes, that's from everything from private donations of materials that we receive from individuals and organizations, but also in thinking about the identifying in our records appraisal process, this applies to government records. So trying to be sure that when we are identifying which records created by state government are going to come to us for permanent preservation, are we doing that with an eye toward making sure that we're collecting information relevant to underserved communities and with people who are continuing to feel the consequences of this long-term economic and racial injustice. So we're trying to do that on multiple fronts, but it takes a lot of thoughtful work, and that's part of what we're trying to do on an everyday basis now.
This is going to be a little different. I was 13 back in 1976 when the first the bicentennial came around, and I remember programs at night in prime time called Bicentennial Minutes. And I'm wondering if something similar is planned for this, what'd you call it,
Quincentennial.
Quincentennial, thank you. And thinking as a researcher, I wonder if it might be interesting to go back and look at those 1976 bicentennial minutes and try to evaluate them for American mythology and bias that might be present there.
That's a great suggestion. I'll say the approach to this anniversary is a little different than what we saw in 1976. There is a national commission. You saw their logo on the screen. It has some things in common with the bicentennial. Both of those efforts had struggled with false starts in the national boards that were responsible for them. They essentially rebooted that process ahead of 1976 after getting a hard time getting off the ground. And if you have followed, the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post have been publishing reporting on problems that have really plagued the current effort at the national level. I think most people in the public history community who are paying attention to this feel like the National Commission has not served us especially well on two fronts. One is its internal problems, and they've had tremendous staff turnover and allegations of discriminatory treatment of the employees and just a bad situation. The other is that it was born of a congressional effort that was kind of popped up out of nowhere and created a charge for that body to focus on the 13 original states and specifically at the events of 1776. So at the outset, there wasn't a good conversation about who should be part of the process and what should be its purpose. So over the last few years, there have been efforts to try to expand that scope a little bit and make sure that this is going to be an opportunity for all Americans to participate, but I don't know that that's yet being seen in terms of leadership of that national body. There is an alternative approach to this that is being led by organizations in the public history community. They include the American Historical Association, the American Association for State and Local History, a whole network of allied organizations that are having their own unofficial side conversations about this and which have developed what I believe is a really useful document called Making History at 250, a field guide to the semi-quincentennial. And it is designed to be truly inclusive, both geographically but chronologically as well, and to say that what we need is not just a celebration of what happened in 13 colonies, but to talk about the American experience writ large. And so to think about the revolution as an ongoing process, the unfinished revolution that we are continuing to try to advance as we expand social and justice and civil and human rights in our country. And I would recommend that resource to any of you. If you go to aaslh.org, you'll find an entire section of that website devoted to the 250th. And it provides a thematic approach that any organization could, you don't have to necessarily create new programming. This initiative, this program could be part of that 250th commemoration because of the very subject of civic virtue and civil rights and social justice issues that you're exploring in this series here fits into one of those themes that have been highlighted by the AASLH. And I'm hoping that they're going to do more to really track what organizations are doing around the country to try to promote that. I've been sharing that. There's actually a print publication that I should have brought with me today, but it's also online, and I would encourage any of you who are interested in that and taking a look at it. But back to your specific question, I don't know that, I'm not aware of anyone who's specifically looking at that. I think most of us are starting with a presupposition that it needs to be broader and more inclusive than 50 years ago, and trying to do that through any number of types of programming and mechanisms. Alabama has a state commission that has been created and has had one meeting so far, and I'm one of 9 people, I think, on that body. We just came out of our bicentennial a few years ago, so we did this in a big way. From 2017 to 2019, I don't know that the state's going to invest quite as much in the 250th, but a lot of those efforts are going to be focused on the American Village in Montevallo, if you're familiar with that organization. But the 250 is going to be whatever we make of it. It's not, we can't wait for a national body to provide leadership and tell us what's going to happen. I think it's up to communities to decide what's important, what do we do in that occasion, what conversations do we think are important, and that's what the 250 is going to be in the lives of Americans and Alabamians.
I applaud you for the long overdue but nonetheless commendable and possibly brave reorientation of the archives. As a political scientist, I wonder and actually know that this is a very divisive issue, even among young people, because we discussed the issue of how we should look at Southern history, at Alabama history, how we want to present ourselves, and also knowing that there is quite some backlash and institutional resistance whenever, similar reorientations, reprogramming, reorganizations occur. And I just wonder, how much of that did you encounter and how did you address it?
We did encounter some criticism. I would think much of it was rooted in misunderstanding or misinformation about what this means for us. I mentioned the rumor mill started about us deaccessioning massive amounts of our collection, and we wanted to try to correct that. One of the things that I would say that we've also worked really hard at is to try to earn and maintain a reputation as an honest broker, as an organization that is going to speak the truth as we understand it, and to base that what we say on reliable information and sources of information, and to, I think, maintain that sense that we are here to serve all Alabamians. And some people are not going to agree with our approaches to interpretation of Alabama history. They're not going to agree with some of the speakers that we bring to our public programs at our agency, but we feel like we can demonstrate that we are being good stewards and engaging in responsible efforts to promote good history education in the classroom, for example. And sometimes that amounts to, that's as simple as not engaging in kind of the polarizing name calling and, trying to take a middle way in the way that we interact with people and in the way that we speak. But also not being reluctant to speak when we feel like serious policy decisions are being made that are tremendously harmful to this entire body politic and the civic body that we've been talking about today. And so the legislative efforts to abolish what they call divisive concepts, I call it good history, is what's being, attempts are being made to curtail it. I think it's important for all of us who care about those issues to be engaged on that. And that can be fraught with peril sometimes. We were created by the legislature, and we can die by the legislature. But those pieces of legislation are creating policy. And I think institutions, whether we're museum or an archive or an institution of higher education. We have people in this community who have expertise and who have dedicated careers to trying to understand these issues and to teach them either with students or with the general public. I feel like we have an obligation to speak on that as a public policy matter. It's not trying to get into politics, it's a policy matter, and I try to approach it from that perspective and find generally that there's so much heat that comes out of those conversations. When you get down to it, the number of people who are really kind of out there on the fringes and creating a lot of the heat and smoke are not necessarily representative of the larger body, even within the state legislature, if that makes sense.
All right, good morning. Oh, yes, good morning. So I have a question. I am an educator from K-12 and I'm a collegiate. And I'm thinking about what the archives is doing to expand, and be more inclusive of diversity and embracing more history. What are some of the goals that are going to be to target younger people, especially in the K-12? I know you kind of touched on a little bit about the education, but you had the website to emerge during the pandemic. What are going to be things? Because a lot of times the students say, I don't care about history, or especially if they're of color, that don't look like me, so why I need to care about it? So now that you are including it to be more diverse, what are going to be some of those goals to target younger people to make sure they are more involved?
Thank you. So we serve the K-12 community in a couple of different ways. One is the longest tradition is that the archives has for many decades been a destination for especially fourth graders, but other grade levels too, because Alabama is taught principally in the fourth grade, Alabama history. So we continue to do that, and we work really hard to be sure that the experience that they have when they come to the archives is aligned with the state course of study and aligned with what those students are studying in their classrooms, and that the topics of those tours are inclusive, and that they have opportunities to see people who look like them in our building, and to hear about the history that involves their community and their family's history in some way or another. I think that allows us to interact with about 35,000 students a year, a tiny fraction of the students in Alabama. An additional program where we are going out and trying to serve history education more broadly is in our K-12 outreach program, where we provide traveling resources that teachers in any classroom across the state can request that are topically developed. So these are either backpacks or traveling trunks that go out, and it's kind of like getting a piece of the museum coming to your classroom, and we make those available freely. And then importantly, we are serving professional development of K-12 educators. Dr. Severance has been one of our content specialists in our what we call Alabama History Institutes. It's a PD program for all grade level teachers in K-12 that seeks to give them a good grounding in using primary sources in the classroom, but also some good content access and thinking about archives and museums in their own communities around the state as extensions of the classroom. So we're trying to help educators bridge a disconnect that exists sometime between the formal classroom and really excellent informal classroom opportunities that exist out in the public history realm. And those efforts point to themes that speak to diversity and inclusive approaches to history. In fact, registration opened yesterday for our programs this summer, and that's all available on our website. If you know a K-12, if you're a K-12 educator, we encourage you to join us this summer and promote that to your other colleagues. They are 3-day programs that take place in 9 different locations around the state this year. And civil rights history is a prominent theme in those programs. So we're doing that in a multitude of ways. We also have distance learning online field trips for schools who can't come to Montgomery. We know that there are many who don't have the resources to travel, especially if you get most of our field trips come from communities along the interstate corridors. That's again a small portion of the population, and we want to try to be sure that we're serving those in more remote places of the state as well.
I'm going to hope that this question makes sense. So this is a little bit of an accessibility question. So from the point of view of a student who has, never been to an archive, it does seem a little bit daunting because it's not the same as a museum, as I've recently learned. For students who are able to visit the archive either through school or independently, a fear that some may or may not have, or maybe fear is a little bit strong, is that it might be a little bit above our heads, because as a college student, I've experienced that some works or some pieces of information are really designed for scholars or people who are more advanced in their study versus someone who's still in the beginnings of their study. So as the archive, or not as the archive, so how would a student be able to navigate the archive, or what questions would they have to ask in order to come to understand the items that are found in the archive?
Great question. And another innovation that happened with the pandemic is that we created a new online form called a research consultation. You can go find this on our website under the research section. And we encourage visitors, all researchers, to go fill that out before you come see us. And it gives our reference staff an opportunity to become aware of what you're working on, what your interests are, and kind of helps them prepare for when you arrive. And they may even be able to answer some specific questions before you get there. That's a great way to be prepared before you go, is starting the communication with our staff before you're there. And I'll be sure I mention this, the research room is open Tuesday through Saturday, 8:30 to 4:30, closed on Mondays. Another opportunity you have is to travel and visit us as a group with one of your professors. And we have frequently hosted AUM classes, and we love to have them come see us. You can get a little tour, you can get a taste of the museum, you get a taste of the archives, and see even a little bit of a background look at the work that we do behind the scenes to understand how that works. We have a staff who is very approachable and who really want to serve all folks. The largest number of people who come to us to do research are not professional historians or scholars, they're genealogists. And so these are people from all walks of life who, once they get there, they'll find an experience where we've got a really helpful staff of people who want to serve you. So I encourage you to do that and reach out online before you come.
I see that our time has ended for today. Please join me one more time in thanking our speaker, Steve Murray.